When we think of haunted places, we often imagine dilapidated houses or desolate country roads. But what if I told you that some of the most unnerving and well-documented paranormal cases have happened thousands of feet in the air aboard airplanes? Researcher Brent Swanson has uncovered eerie tales of ghostly encounters related to various flights, including Eastern Airlines Flight 401, and many more that suggest that even the skies are not immune to the supernatural. One of the most chilling types of encounters Swanson documented involves passengers who appeared to be physically present, but are later revealed to be nothing more than apparitions. One such case was reported by a Reddit user who worked as a flight attendant on a B-737, a smaller plane with its cockpit door near the passengers' seats. The flight was at cruising altitude when the captain asked why two children were playing in front of the cockpit door. The crew was confused, as there were no children in sight. The captain insisted he could see them on CCTV, and the situation continued to escalate as he repeatedly mentioned the children. When the crew arrived at the hotel after landing, the captain pulled the crew leader aside, questioning whether they really hadn't seen the children. The crew leader confirmed that no children had been near the cockpit door. Strangely, the pilot seemed convinced of what they had seen, leaving the crew bewildered by the encounter. Another Reddit user shared a story from a flight attendant working a red-eye shuttle from San Francisco to New York. Before departure, the crew counted 35 passengers, but when they recounted later during the flight, they only counted 34. The missing passenger was a well-dressed man in his 40s who had been seated at the rear of the plane. One of the flight attendants had even conversed with him about his family. Upon landing, the crew discovered that only 34 passengers had checked in at San Francisco, and there was no record of the man who had been seated at the back of the plane. Swanson's research includes another eerie encounter where a man on a flight from Denver to New York described an elderly woman seated next to him who appeared to be gravely ill. She wore a shawl and had dark circles beneath her eyes. As the flight went on, she seemed to get worse, and the man grew concerned. He eventually approached a flight attendant who went to check on the woman. After inspecting the bathroom and the rest of the plane, the attendant returned with unsettling news. There was no sign of the woman anywhere. The man never saw her again, and to this day he can't explain what happened. Other supernatural encounters aboard airplanes have been tied to specific aircraft. One story comes from Susan Brown, a flight attendant who once worked on a plane with a haunted reputation. The crew told her that a man had died on a previous flight, and his body had been stowed in the cargo hold for transport. The haunting began when a woman approached the crew, requesting a drink. She said she was seated next to her husband, but when the crew brought the drink to the seat she indicated, they found only the man seated there. He informed them that his wife had passed away and was in the cargo hold. What made the situation even stranger was that the drink the crew brought was a Bloody Mary, his wife's favorite drink. In a similar story, Amanda Pleaver, another flight attendant, recounted her experience aboard a plane known as Christine, named after the haunted car in Stephen King's novel. Crew members were reluctant to work on this plane because of strange occurrences, such as lights that would turn on and off by themselves, unusual sounds, and unexplained temperature changes. James Wysong, a flight attendant for United Airlines, shared a haunting experience on an older 747. He and his colleague, Martha, were working in the lower galley when they began to notice strange occurrences: ovens that would turn on and off, overhead lights that dimmed, and an eerie whistle whenever the ovens shut off. When he later reviewed the airplane's mechanical log, he discovered that these issues had been written up many times, yet mechanics were unable to fix or even confirm the problem. Strangely, the disturbances only occurred during flights, and the system was sound when checked on the ground. these accounts of supernatural events on planes have led many to speculate about why such occurrences seem to be tied to specific aircraft. Swanson's research leaves us wondering, could the forces of the supernatural be linked to particular planes? Or is it simply that ghosts can manifest anywhere, even at 30,000 feet? So, the next time you're settling into your seat on a flight or soaring through the clouds, keep an eye out for anything unusual. You might just encounter something that defies explanation. Flying is often an uneventful experience for most people. You board the plane, sit back, and let the hours pass until you reach your destination. For me, that's what I'd always known, until the nightmarish flight from Chicago to Denver that changed my perspective forever. It was a few years ago, during a bitterly cold January evening. Snow blanketed Chicago as I boarded the plane, clutching my carry-on and ticket. The airport was bustling with travelers eager to escape the Midwest chill. The aircraft itself, a seemingly ordinary Boeing 737, was filled with chatter and the occasional cry of a child. Little did any of us know, we were stepping into something far from ordinary. The flight began like any other. As we took off, the seatbelt signs blinked on, the cabin lights dimmed slightly and the hum of the engines filled the air. I settled into my window seat, sipping the coffee I'd grabbed at the terminal. Outside, the sprawling city lights of Chicago disappeared beneath a blanket of clouds. It was peaceful for a time. About halfway through the flight, the temperature began to drop. At first, it was subtle. A chill ran through the cabin, and I pulled my jacket tighter around me. Other passengers did the same, rubbing their arms or adjusting their air vents. Then it grew colder, rapidly. Within minutes, it felt like we were sitting in a freezer. I glanced at the flight attendants who were hurriedly moving up and down the aisle, whispering to each other and occasionally checking the thermostat in the galley. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we seem to be experiencing a malfunction with the air conditioning system. We're working to resolve the issue. Please remain seated and keep your seatbelts fastened." Passengers murmured anxiously, but most seemed willing to trust the explanation. After all, malfunctions happen, right? Yet, the frost forming on the windows told a different story. I pressed my hand against the glass and felt the biting cold seep through. It wasn't just chilly, it was unnatural. The crew distributed blankets to the passengers, but it did little to combat the bone-chilling cold. My breath fogged in the air, and my fingers stiffened as I tried to hold my coffee cup. The child seated across the aisle began to cry, his mother frantically wrapping him in layers of clothing. The tension in the cabin was palpable. Then it happened. A loud, guttural scream echoed from the rear of the plane. Every head turned in unison, eyes wide with fear. It wasn't the scream of a frightened passenger, it was something otherworldly, filled with rage and anguish. My heart raced as I craned my neck to see what was happening. Several passengers near the back of the plane gasped and pointed. "There!" someone shouted. Standing near the emergency exit was a figure, a man dressed in old-fashioned clothes. His appearance was hazy, like a projection flickering in and out of focus. He wore a mechanic's jumpsuit, the kind you'd expect to see in the 1960s or 70s. His eyes burned with an intensity that sent shivers down my spine. Then, just as suddenly as he appeared, he vanished into thin air. Panic erupted. Passengers screamed, flight attendants tried to calm everyone down, and the captain's voice came over the intercom once again, urging us to remain seated. But how could we? We had all seen it. The temperature continued to plummet and the frost on the windows thickened. It felt as though the plane itself was being consumed by a deep freeze. I gripped the armrest of my seat, my mind racing. Was it a hallucination? A trick of the light? No. Too many people had seen the same thing. The screaming, the figure, the unnatural cold. It all pointed to something far beyond a mechanical malfunction. The rest of the flight passed in a haze of fear and discomfort. The temperature never returned to normal, and the eerie atmosphere lingered. When we finally touched down in Denver, the relief was almost overwhelming. Passengers practically bolted from their seats, desperate to escape the cursed aircraft. As I exited the plane, I noticed a group of airline staff gathered near the gate, speaking in hushed tones. Their expressions were grim. I overheard snippets of their conversation. Words like, "not again," and "we need to report this." It was clear that this was not the first time something like this had happened on that plane. A few days later, I received an email from the airline apologizing for the discomfort experienced during the flight. They offered a voucher for a future trip, but no explanation was given for the events that transpired. Determined to find answers, I did some digging. What I uncovered sent chills down my spine. Years ago, a maintenance worker had died aboard that very plane. The details were vague, but the story went that he had been trapped in the cargo hold during a routine inspection. By the time anyone realized he was missing, it was too late. The circumstances of his death were shrouded in mystery, but rumors among the airline staff suggested his spirit never left the aircraft. A former flight attendant who spoke to me on condition of anonymity confirmed the rumors. "That plane is cursed," she said. "Every crew member knows it. Strange things happen. Lights flicker, passengers report seeing shadows, and then there's the cold. It always gets so cold. Since that nightmarish flight, I've become uneasy about flying. Every time I step onto a plane, I can't help but glance at the windows, half expecting to see frost forming. The memory of that chilling figure standing at the back of the cabin haunts me to this day. Perhaps he's still out there, trapped between worlds, forever bound to that aircraft. And if you ever find yourself on a flight where the temperature drops unexpectedly, remember this story. You might not just be feeling the chill of high-altitude air. You could be feeling the presence of something far colder, something that doesn't belong in our world." I've been an air traffic controller for over a decade. In that time, I've experienced everything from routine flights to situations that tested my skills under pressure. I'd been trained to handle stress and uncertainty, but nothing had prepared me for what happened that night. It started out like any other late shift at the tower. The hum of the radar screens filled the room, and the low buzz of communications channels echoed through the air. The controllers were alert, focused, and sharp. It was just after midnight, the time when the skies are usually quiet, with only a handful of flights left to direct. My job, as always, was to monitor the radar, communicate with pilots, and keep everything running smoothly. I'd been with the Federal Aviation Administration, FAA, long enough to understand the intricate dance of planes soaring through the air. Most flights are routine, operating like well-oiled machines, but I knew that a single mistake or miscommunication could bring disaster. I wasn't about to let anything slip past me. That night, though, it wasn't a mistake I was worried about. It was something far more sinister. The first odd thing came when I noticed a flight number I didn't recognize. Normally, when a pilot requests a frequency change or needs assistance, they use their call sign or flight number, which I'm familiar with from reviewing flight plans. But this flight, Flight 5321, didn't show up on any of my systems. There was no listed flight plan for it, no scheduled departure or arrival, nothing. I dismissed it as another technical glitch, a common enough issue when dealing with the sheer volume of data flowing through our systems. Maybe it was a delayed flight trying to cut in or a communication error. But then the pilot's voice crackled through the radio. "Mayday, Mayday, Mayday, this is Flight 5321. We've lost control. We need immediate assistance." The voice was calm at first, but there was an underlying edge of panic that made my heart race. It wasn't the type of calm panic I had heard from pilots in real emergencies. This was desperate, almost frantic. I grabbed the microphone. "Flight 5321, this is Tower 3. We are unable to locate you on radar. Please provide your coordinates immediately." The response was fast, but not at all what I expected. "We're over the Atlantic, altitude 20,000 feet. Please, we can't hold it much longer." I glanced at the radar screen again, my eyes scanning the empty skies. There was nothing, not a single blip. That airspace was completely clear. No flights were scheduled to be in that vicinity at that hour. "Flight 5321, do you have your tail number?" I asked, now starting to feel a cold unease settle in my stomach. It's 5321. The voice was shaky, and there was a noticeable drop in volume as if the pilot was growing weaker. "Please help us. The line suddenly erupted in static, a garbled mess of white noise and crackling radio signals. I adjusted the frequency, trying to clear the interference. The crackling lasted for several seconds, growing louder and more distorted until it stopped entirely. The line went dead. I sat there for a moment, stunned, unable to comprehend what had just happened. A flight I couldn't locate. A pilot I couldn't identify. A distress call from an empty part of the sky. I felt my pulse quicken and a cold sweat formed on the back of my neck. Something wasn't right. I repeated the transmission. "Flight 5321, do you copy?" There was no response. The silence in the tower was almost deafening. The other controllers were still busy, focused on their own communications and aircraft, unaware of the strange incident that had just unfolded. I took a deep breath and tried to steady myself. I couldn't let my imagination run wild, but I had to be sure. Something was off, and I needed to find out what it was. I pulled up the flight logs on my workstation, searching for any reference to Flight 5321. There was nothing. No record of a scheduled flight, no flight plan failed, no communication about a plane that might be lost. I decided to go a step further. I looked up the flight number in the FAA's internal database, expecting to find an error or some kind of technical issue. But what I found froze me in place. Flight 5321 had been listed as a lost flight. 40 years ago, it had been a routine commercial flight traveling from New York City to London, but it had vanished somewhere over the Atlantic without a trace. The wreckage had never been found, and the official record had marked it as an accident, one of the many unsolved mysteries of aviation history. The flight had been lost in 1981. The same flight number I had just received a distress call from. My mind raced. It couldn't be. There had to be some logical explanation. Maybe it was a coincidence, a similar flight number, an old, dormant frequency somehow activating. But then the memories came flooding back, the voice of the pilot, the panic in their voice, the urgency in their words. They had said they were over the Atlantic, 20,000 feet in the air, the exact same location and altitude as the wreckage site of Flight 5321. I stood up from my chair, my legs weak beneath me, and paced around the control room. My colleagues hadn't noticed my sudden agitation, and I was grateful for that. I had to think. I had to get to the bottom of this, but every time I tried to piece it together, my mind tangled in knots. I pulled out my phone and started researching Flight 5321, hoping for a different answer. But all I found were the same old articles, records, and discussions about the disappearance. No new information, no leads. It was as if the flight had never existed in the first place, At least, not in the way it should have. I felt a strange compulsion to go deeper, to find out more about the flight and the people who had been on board. Maybe there was something I was missing, something buried in the records that would make sense of this. I found a few articles from the time, but most of them were vague. The plane had been en route to London when it simply vanished, its last known coordinates placing it over the Atlantic in the dead of night. The last radio transmission had been a simple distress call. "We are losing control, Mayday." The same words I had just heard. But the most chilling detail came from one particular report, a detail I had overlooked until now. The last transmission from Flight 5321 had been received just minutes before the plane disappeared from radar. The pilot had mentioned a strange interference before the line cut out. That interference, was it the same static I had heard? I couldn't breathe. The lines between logic and the unexplainable were blurring, and I didn't know what to believe anymore. The tower was quieter now, my colleagues finishing up their shifts and preparing to head home. I should have done the same. I should have gone home, put this out of my mind, and chalked it up to an overactive imagination or a technical glitch. But I couldn't. I had to know more. The next day, I reached out to a former colleague who had worked with me in the tower for years. I told him what had happened, hesitantly at first, unsure of how he would react. He listened quietly, then sighed. "You're not the first to hear something like that, you know." "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice cracking. "Flights like that, flights that went missing, sometimes they don't just disappear. Some of us believe they never really left. Some people say they've heard things, seen things. I don't know how to explain it, but it's happened before. These things have a way of coming back." I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. Over the next few weeks, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had somehow connected with something beyond the living. I started researching similar cases, looking for anything that might explain what I had experienced. In every case, the patterns were strikingly similar. Pilots lost over the ocean, their flights never found, and in some instances, reports of strange transmissions or eerie encounters in the skies. I couldn't get over the sensation that Flight 5321 wasn't the only one. That somewhere, in some corner of the world, other lost flights were waiting to be found, or perhaps still searching for someone to listen. I'm a pilot with over 15 years of flying experience, and I've seen my fair share of strange things in the sky. But nothing in my career could prepare me for what happened during a routine domestic flight. The day started like any other: clear skies, calm weather, and a full flight. We reached cruising altitude at 30,000 feet, and everything seemed normal as we continued on our path. But then, something outside the cockpit window caught my eye. At first, I thought I was seeing things. A shadow, a large shifting form, was gliding alongside our plane, effortlessly keeping pace with us. It didn't make sense. I scanned the horizon, but there were no other aircraft nearby. The radar showed no blips, and the flight was proceeding as scheduled. My co-pilot was focused on his instruments, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The shadow moved in and out of view, darting beneath us with startling speed, faster than any aircraft I'd ever seen. My heart raced, but I tried to stay composed. I turned to my co-pilot, pointing out the shadow outside. He looked at the window but saw nothing. I couldn't explain it, but I knew what I saw. Then it happened. A sudden, panicked scream came over the intercom from one of the flight attendants. She said that passengers in the back of the cabin were screaming too. Some were shouting about shadows moving up and down the aisles, shapes that seemed to be following them. The plane was still at cruising altitude, and nothing on the radar indicated any other planes or unusual activity. but the fear in the flight attendants' voices was undeniable. I felt a chill run down my spine. My job is to keep calm in situations like this, but something about this felt different, something otherworldly. I told the co-pilot to maintain course, but as the screams intensified, I couldn't help but feel like we were being watched. I glanced out the cockpit window again. The shadow was still there, keeping its distance but always in view. The eerie feeling of being pursued weighed heavily on me. It wasn't just the shadows outside that unnerved us, it was the passengers. As we made our descent toward our destination, there was a palpable sense of dread in the air. When we finally landed, people were visibly shaken. Some were crying, some were silent, and others refused to leave the plane at all. I had never seen anything like it in my career. After the plane was parked, maintenance crews boarded to inspect it. That's when they found something that no one could explain. There were deep, jagged scratches along the underside of the aircraft, scratches that didn't appear to have come from any known source. The type of damage was unlike anything we'd ever seen. No one could offer a reasonable explanation, but it was clear that something had happened during that flight, something beyond our understanding. That flight changed everything for me. I've flown countless miles in my career, but the memory of those screaming passengers and the shadow that followed us has never left me. It made me question the boundaries of reality, what we can see, what we can explain, and what may be lurking just beyond our perception. And every time I board a plane now, I can't help but wonder if I'll encounter something out there again. Something that defies logic, something that we can't yet comprehend,